Israel has absolutely defeated Hamas. And I don't know why they aren't taking the win that's on a plate in front of them. Look, the big difference between Gaza and all of these wars is the fact that the civilian population in Gaza have not been allowed to evacuate by Egypt. Unreasonable to expect Israel to allow all of these 2 million people into Israeli territory after they just committed 7th of October. That's just not going to happen. Politically, it would be unacceptable. The only place they could have fled to was Egypt, and Egypt's response was to seal them in with a border fence that puts Israel to shame, quite frankly.
I have a feeling that this entire war is understood in two binaries. It's either understood in the aggressively pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist view, which is essentially the IDF can do no wrong, everything's fine in Gaza, they're just wiping out Hamas, that's it. Or the other binary is, this is the world's most horrific genocide.
We need an end to the occupation, we need an end to the apartheid system and preventing states such as Israel from committing the worst possible war crimes.
What's the actual truth? My name is Stefan Tompson, I'm the founder of Visagrad24, and today I'm in London with Andrew Fox, who is an expert at the Henry Jackson Society, a British military veteran, and a friend of mine. We've been to Gaza together, and you have just come back from Gaza. Tell me about going to the aid sites. The biggest debate right now around Israel, and so we've met and we've spent some time in Israel together. We went to Gaza together. We didn't go to the West Bank yet together, but when over the course of the last 2 years, almost 2 years now, the first focus was the occupation of Gaza, then it was the genocide claims, now it's the starvation claims. That's the biggest claim against Israel right now. You were one of the first foreign journalists to enter Gaza and to see the distribution sites being run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think that the best summary of it in kind of one sentence is right idea, wrong location.
Okay.
I think that's kind of the issue right now, because if we look at the starvation claims in the round, they're nonsense, binary, silly accusations. But the situation is nuanced and complicated, and to reduce it to just saying one side or the other is to blame is a very childish and biased way of approaching the problem. Look, the simple fact is, first of all, there is enough aid in Gaza for everyone. Like we know from the UN's own figures, there should have been easily enough food in Gaza to last till the end of July as a minimum. But the fact it's not reaching people means there's a distribution issue. Now, let's unpack some more statistics. If we look at the UN's own figures about how many of their convoys have been intercepted and haven't made it intact to their destination, it's at 85%. 85% of their food convoys are getting nicked by somebody, intercepted by somebody. Be that Hamas, be that another militant group. It doesn't really matter. The point is, it's not getting to the people who need it. The next statistic I think that's important is that 0% of Gaza Humanitarian Foundation resupply runs have been intercepted. 100% of the aid they've taken into Gaza has made it to the distribution sites and made it into the hands of people who need it.
How have they made that happen? How has the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation managed to achieve what the UN, which has decades of experience with this sort of operation, why has a newly founded foundation managed to do this and not the United Nations?
Two things. They're delivering to a secure area that's secured by the IDF. It's effectively behind IDF front lines.
Okay.
And that is a problem that we'll go on to in a minute. And secondly, because they have armed guards front and rear, protected vehicles, and there's no way anyone can possibly get close to them.
And these armed guards are American military contractors?
Yes, American former military contractors, to be really accurate.
Okay.
We don't want to set hairs running about the United States military getting involved. Most of the guys I met were ex-Marines, ex-Army or ex-US Special Forces, so the Green Berets, as they're more commonly known. But it's easy for them to get the aid in because it's protected and because it's going to a protected area. The problem with that is that it means that Gazan civilians have to walk through Israeli front lines, through an area where there are numbers of Israeli bases stationed, down one very set route to get to the distribution site. And the issue we're seeing where people are getting injured and killed is, first of all, if they stray from that route, warning shots are there to drive them back onto the route, which clearly comes with the risk of ricochet. It comes with the risk of rounds overshooting and landing where they shouldn't or weren't intended to. And that's where people get injured. Or secondly, if they go off the route and they stumble across an Israeli base or similar, then you've got, a very small Israeli unit potentially about to be surrounded by thousands of civilians, and they're clearly panicking and opening fire as a result. And the Israelis have said they're investigating those events where people have been shot and killed. But it's not ideal to have civilians having to walk for miles, because obviously that precludes the very weakest and the very hungriest, if they are at that stage of starvation where they are low on energy. That's going to be really tricky to get many miles. And then, of course, making them run the gamut of potentially going wrong on their route in and running into the IDF. So it's really tricky. The much better idea, I think, would be to have it forward of those lines. But then, of course, it's much harder to secure the route, and then they run the risk of aid getting taken. But they can offset that with the military guards. So, the bones of a really good scheme are here. They've delivered over 100 million meals at this point. People are getting fed. Aid isn't going to Hamas, certainly not on the way in. What it needs is expanding, and what it needs is moving into areas where the civilians don't have to go quite so far through quite such dangerous terrain to get the food they need.
Tell me about the situation on the ground in terms of the Palestinian people themselves. Are Gazans actually going hungry? Are they starving? Are people dying of hunger? How much of this is true, and how much of this is Pallywood, as virulent pro-Israeli, sort of aggressively pro-Israeli accounts will discount all of this to Pallywood. And on the other hand, aggressively anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli accounts will say, mass starvation, thousands of dying, tens of thousands dying, all of Gaza's hungry. What's the actual truth?
Well, there's no kind of evidence, even from the Gaza Ministry of Health, that thousands of people are dying of hunger. That's just not manifested. The really important kind of distinction to make is between those who have food and those who can't get food. So if they're Hamas connected, if they're militant group connected, if they're wealthy before the war, they're probably fine. And you can see that on accounts like Imshin on X, showing people in cafes making pancakes or whatever it is. There are people who are doing just fine with no issue whatsoever. There are then the poorer people who don't have those connections, who are suddenly having to pay incredibly inflated prices in markets to try and get their hands on food and just simply can't afford it. If you go on Gaza and Telegram groups, you'll see them trying to trade barter for just a kilo of flour.
Yeah.
Do you know where the food is? Where can we go to buy it? And the fact that it's been flooded with aid. Nobody should be paying for this stuff. It's not designed to be sold in markets. The fact is it's been seized and it's being sold by malign actors who are the targets of a lot of ire from Gazan civilians. They hate these people for their theft and for their leveraging of people's misery. So the truth is, some pockets, there will be people who are genuinely really hungry, cresting famine, but they're few and far between. The majority of people, I think, if they're poor and less well connected, will be hungry and they will be struggling to find food, but not starving. And then if they're of the upper echelons of that society, they're doing just fine and they're able to eat whatever they want.
Can you explain the situation on the ground? I mean, you just mentioned Gazans sitting in cafes. If you were to be, again, I have a feeling that this entire war is understood in two binaries. It's either understood in the aggressively pro-Israeli, pro-Zionist view, which is essentially the IDF can do no wrong, everything's fine in Gaza, they're just wiping out Hamas, that's it. Or the other binary is, this is the world's most horrific genocide, right? And you see these incredible images, including from, there have been a series of aid drops by Arab nations. And I believe it was a Jordanian camera, it was a Jordanian plane, there was a cameraman on board who captured this it is astounding footage of the word that comes to mind is desolation.
Yeah,
there's nothing there. You drove when you went to the aid distribution site. You drove through a part of Gaza.
Yes.
So where are the cafes? Where's the destruction? Could you kind of give us a visualization of that?
Yeah. So certain areas have been bulldozed. literally bulldozed. Because, I mean, think about the tactics here. So why were they blown up in the first place? It's because they were target locations, or because they had tunnel shafts attached, or because there was an IED in the house. And the Israelis don't have time to go and defuse every IED. There's thousands of them. They'd still be trying to clear Rafah now if they tried to defuse every bomb. Because if somebody's been firing at them from it, they've returned fire, as they have every legal right to do. But it leaves the buildings damaged, it leaves them dangerous, and it leaves incredibly difficult terrain to fight in. So they have just bulldozed all the damaged buildings, which, is a horrifying sight.
And you drove through this?
We did, yeah. There's not a building standing in Rafah. Not a building. It's
and there were people
ruined.
there?
No. So the people were only allowed into that area of Rafah to get the food, and then they had to leave again.
And where did they go?
So they go to areas north of where the Israeli front lines are, where the buildings haven't yet been bulldozed. So they're staying in tents, they're staying in damaged buildings. 20% of Gaza's buildings are fine. So obviously there are people who are in those areas who are carrying on with almost normal life, if not quite normal. Obviously there will be airstrikes, threats, and that sort of thing. But they're living far better conditions than those poor people who've been pushed into tents.
And did you drive through Rafah? You walked through it? Did you stop?
Drove through. There's nowhere to stop. It's literally just a dirt road with rubble, bulldozed, twisted steel, just bulldozed to create paths and roads through the areas. It's astonishing. It is absolute devastation. I understand why. If you're trying to winkle Hamas out of every area.
Is this something you've seen in the Middle East in your time serving in the army?
Not to that, I was in Afghanistan. That was my main fighting tour, and that's very different. But I've seen buildings turn to rubble by airstrikes multiple times.
But never on this scale.
No, but Afghanistan was a different war. Afghanistan was a counterinsurgency. We were trying to minimise collateral damage as a main effort. So the key difference between Afghanistan and Gaza is that Afghanistan was a counterinsurgency operation where the main effort was the prevention of collateral damage. We were doing everything we could to make sure there was no collateral damage. Gaza is far more a conventional war where the IDF is trying to take apart infrastructure. It's trying to take apart Hamas's strategic tunnel network and their fighting locations. There's no way to do that without collateral. So collateral damage in that kind of a war is a feature rather than a bug. Whereas in Afghanistan, it was only exceptionally would be certainly on the later tours would we be allowed to drop bombs that would level people's homes and houses. So it's a very, very different conflict.
Is there anything comparable to the level of destruction that you saw in Rafah in terms of infrastructure in warfare? Is there anything in recent times that comes close to this?
Yeah, in recent times you can look at Mosul, you can look at Raqqa. Look, the big difference between Gaza and all of these wars is the fact that the civilian population in Gaza have not been allowed to evacuate by Egypt. Like, unreasonable to expect Israel to allow all of these 2 million people into Israeli territory after they just committed 7th of October. That's just not going to happen. Politically, it would be unacceptable. The only place they could have fled to was Egypt, and Egypt's response was to seal them in with a border fence that puts Israel to shame, quite frankly.
I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary borders. The videos of it are just insane. The only comparable border that I have seen was the Spanish-Moroccan border in Ceuta, which is, it's just it's quite similar actually in scope and size, and it's multiple walls and security guards patrolling it at all times. And that one got stormed. There's incredible videos of sub-Saharan migrants who make it across the Sahara, and then they conglomerate. Actually, my brother and I, many, many years ago, it's been about 10 years ago, we went looking for them. We crossed from Ceuta into Morocco proper, and then drove around looking for a group of migrants to be able to storm the border with them. We sadly didn't succeed. We got arrested before we found them. That was the end of that attempt. But there's incredible videos of these groups storming the border. That hasn't happened in Egypt. Is that because the Egyptians would simply open fire?
Yeah,
because the Spaniards wouldn't obviously open fire on a. That's just against,
Yeah, look, Egypt is not letting these people through. I mean, they've seen what happened with Jordan and Palestinian refugees. They saw what happened in Lebanon with Palestinian refugees, and the fact that both of them ended up in civil wars. Like, they've already got a destabilized Sinai, with the Bedouin insurgency that they've been working very, very hard to get a handle on.
Yeah.
They're friends with Israel at the moment-ish. There's a tenuous peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, but it's not enough that they would say, hey, we'll take the Palestinians, you go deal with Hamas. That's just not going to happen. So, but the point is, Hamas on one side, Egypt on the other, stopping them evacuating, and an IDF that is trying to take apart infrastructure that has infested every single part of Gaza, every single part, every mosque, every school, every hospital, every UNRWA base. Everything has Hamas infrastructure attached to it. And so everything is destroyed. And of course, if you want to blow up a tunnel, everything above that tunnel is going to get a slice of the damage as well. So there is a reason the damage is so massive. And you can debate all day whether that's a good military strategy or not, but it's not illegal. And it's not directed at the civilian population, because if it were, we would have a huge number, more than 60,000 dead. And in terms of civilians, it's of course far below 60,000 dead because of the number of Hamas fighters that have been killed. So, again, it's shades of grey and nuance. We can discuss the strategy, but to say that it's indiscriminate, I think is wrong.
I've seen a quote that says that no country has done as much as Israel has for civilians in enemy territory. Is that something you would agree with? Has any country done more for the civilians of a country they're fighting in than Israel?
I'm really skeptical of these kinds of comparisons. You get people saying, it's just like Northern Ireland, so they should have used Northern Ireland tactics, or it's just like ISIS, so they should have fought the campaign differently, or why didn't they fight Gaza like they fought Lebanon? And these aren't helpful because, look, yes, Israel's done loads for Gaza civilians. They've certainly killed far fewer of them than perhaps they could have done had they were being a little bit less careful. They've definitely set, I think, a platinum standard in civilian protection in terms of lives. But on the flip side of that, they've leveled the entire place, which, isn't doing the civilians a huge favor. They're not going to thank Israel for that.
No.
So, it's this shades of grey, and we just need to look at this in the round without the hysterical narratives attached to it. Either this whole most moral army thing, which I've never liked as a thing to say about any army, because no army's moral, because they're fundamentally employed to engage in immorality, i.e. killing people. So I've never liked that phrase, and I've never used it. And then on the flip side, you've got the screeching, hysterical genocide crowd who add no value to this conversation and don't help. They don't help Gazans. They don't help anyone suffering in that war zone. It's just a useless addendum to the debate to try and debase Israel on the world stage and doesn't really solve anything. So let's try and find this middle way where Israel's not perfect. Gazan civilians aren't perfect either, but there is a moral duty, I would suggest, to make sure nobody dies of starvation when they don't have to. And obviously Hamas need to be destroyed as the other party here. So let's try and find that balance and have a sensible conversation about this rather than screeching on both sides.
How is it possible that almost 2 years after the fighting started, Israel, which clearly is the far superior army, has not managed to defeat Hamas, which is, if you look at it, it sort of felt like at least it was being described in the media as a sort of rather inefficient ragtag group of, and yet they've been fighting for 2 years, and it would appear they're still quite actively fighting back. How's this possible?
You see, I don't think that's a fair description of Hamas. They were a pretty well-organised, dismounted army at the start of the war. They had platoons, companies, battalions, and not in the way the IRA did, in actual the way that we would recognise it as a Western army. When they had Gaza City on 7th, 8th of October, they had defensive positions dug in with overlapping arcs of fire. They tried company-level counterattacks on the IDF. This was an army. Obviously, they've since fragmented into a ragtag guerrilla bunch, but they certainly started off a lot more credibly than that. But to answer your question, Israel has absolutely defeated Hamas. And I don't know why they aren't taking the win that's on a plate in front of them. Let's look at what they've achieved against Hamas. Their strategic capabilities are destroyed. And by strategic, I mean the ability to launch it beyond the borders of Gaza. Any rocket, 1, 2 at most, tops, an Iron Dome will take that down straight away. So there's no threat from rockets. Not a chance are they going to be able to repeat 7th of October, so that's safe. They've lost 25-ish thousand of their fighters. Every single one of their key commanders from before the war, both Sinwars, Dave, every battalion commander bar about one, I think, If you look at the deck of cards they handed out at the start of the war, I think almost everyone in that deck of cards is dead.
Yeah.
Hundreds of miles of tunnels have been damaged or destroyed. And Hamas's grip over the population is starting to weaken. Like, that's a win. That's a win all day long by any possible military metric. And yet Israel, for some reason, at the strategic level, is not taking that win. The war is being prolonged for reasons that I don't personally understand. And I think potentially, the Prime Minister is pushing this one for political reasons, because militarily it doesn't make any sense. And the IDF agree with me. They're on record at the moment as opposing this mad plan to occupy the entirety of Gaza. So, there's a win. It's right there. All you have to do is take it. And yet, for some reason, Israel are not taking that win.
What do you think is the best case scenario for Gaza after the hostilities end?
I mean, I think it's the same. But my position hasn't really changed since May last year. Mm-hmm. I wrote an article for the tablet. It's called Israel Succeeding in Gaza, I think, which isn't a headline I chose. You don't get to pick the headlines in these magazines. They choose them for you. It's not the one I'd have chosen, but I think that the body of the article is good. And I make the case that you're never going to destroy Hamas in its entirety. You're never going to kill every single Hamas gunman. You're never going to destroy every single inch of Hamas tunnels. But what you can do is utterly neuter them, which they've done, at which point you can withdraw and just say, hey, we're now sealing off Gaza. We're going to throw money at the people who are opposing Hamas. We're going to make sure the aid goes in, make sure the medicine goes in, but nothing else is going in until you give us our hostages back. And only then can you rebuild, reconstruct, and we're going to do that under really, really strict conditions so that you don't start trying to rebuild terror tunnels. And we're reserving the right to strike back in at will if we see you trying to rearm or trying to create more terror infrastructure. That's how the win pays out. And if at the same time, the people that you're empowering to take the place of Hamas, if you can convince them that from the river to the sea is never going to happen, and actually if they do accept the existence of the state of Israel and become the emirate of Gaza, where you have suddenly access to reconstruction money, you have the money that was always there but was pushed into the terror tunnels, if you start actually using that for the benefit of people, then that's progress. Something needs to be done at the UN level to remove this ridiculous hereditary refugee status that Palestinians have, because by implying that they're refugees, you're implying that they're refugees from somewhere, and that somewhere is obviously Israel. And the implication of them being refugees is that someday they will be able to go back to a different country that isn't Israel. So that ties into this ridiculous narrative that somehow Israel's going anywhere. So if we start unpacking all of these things, it's not going to take us 100% of the way to peace, but it's certainly going to take us a much greater distance towards peace than we currently are now. So, my take is incremental baby steps. Just, do this a salami slice at a time, and who knows, maybe eventually you'll get to the end of the sausage and you'll have a much happier Gaza.
You're one of the very few voices that are, I don't know if you consider yourself pro-Israel. A lot of what you say sounds pro-Israel, so I guess you could be described as a pro-Israeli voice on social media. As the war has progressed, as I've been looking at social media, the level of support for Israel is dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping to a sort of almost handful of accounts on X and handful of YouTube channels. Well, how does it feel to be one of these sort of lone voices that, in a sea of accusations of Israel being a genocidal state, an apartheid state, a colonial construct, and is now busy starving Palestinian children? How does it feel to be one of the lone pro-Israel voices online?
I think we have to disambiguate pro-Israel and pro-Gaza war. I think that's an important thing to separate out. So, people call me a Zionist online. It's like, yeah. I believe in the existence of the state of Israel. There you go. You call me a Zionist. That's what I am. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. But, I try and do exactly what I've just done throughout the entire war, and that's really try and stay true to what I think is right. And people might think what I think is right is wrong. And if they have a civil way of putting that across, they're very welcome to. And I'll happily discuss and debate with people who can maintain civility. Unfortunately, that is quite rare on social media. I've analysed this war consistently. I've said right at the start, I approve of the fact that Israel had to fight this war. I've looked at how they do targeting. I've looked at how they have rules of engagement.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy that they are in line with at least as good as anything I'd have seen with the US or the American Army or the British Army. I also know that they've done things wrong and soldiers have crossed the line and done stuff wrong, because I've spoken to the Military Advocate General Corps in Israel, and I know that they're investigating their own soldiers for misdemeanors and crimes on the battlefield. So I'm happy to say that. That doesn't mean I don't support Israel, I don't support the war. It just means that I accept that armies are flawed. They're made up of people. People make mistakes and do bad things, and that's no different to any other army. And then last July, I think, was the first time I suggested that there should be a ceasefire. Kind of, I was starting to lean in that direction. And I think Israeli strategy was good up to the point they sacked Yoav Gallant, and I think it's dropped off a cliff since. And I'm happy to say that. But that doesn't mean I don't think Israel should exist as a country, and it doesn't change the fact that I believe in the country itself. I just think that constructive criticism from kind of concerned friends is the way forward at this point. And it's been getting progressively less well organised strategically. And again, I'm happy to say that. So I throughout this entire war, I've tried to keep that line. And, I've had people say to me, look, you can't say that. So trigonometry, I said that there were instances of the IDF being trigger happy.
Sure.
And I know there are, because I've interviewed IDF soldiers who've told me. I've spoken to people in the sort of the legal department of the IDF, the MAC, who've told me. So I'm not going to not say it. The answer is not for me not to say it. The answer is for the IDF not to do it. And those kinds of constructive criticisms I think are useful, and they make you far more balanced as an analyst if you're doing that, rather than just being a cheerleader who insists that everything Israel does is perfect, because clearly it's not.
One of the interesting consequences of the war is that it's not really confined to Israel or Gaza. The war has spilled over everywhere. It's become a global war, and it's certainly felt on our streets. And by our streets, I mean the streets of Western cities, capitals. We've also seen in the UK the rise of sectarian politics, a return of sectarian politics that hasn't been seen, well, perhaps it has been in Northern Ireland, but I guess in England proper, the last time there was sectarian politics was Cromwell, a while back. We've seen 4 Gaza independents be elected. What do you make of the impact? How do you explain the impact that the Israel-Hamas war has had on specifically the United Kingdom and more broadly the West?
Well, I've always said there are 2 wars being fought here. There's actually what's going on in Gaza, and there's the screeching information war that's happening in the West. And what I think it's done is rip the mask off a number of really deep underlying problems with our societies. Mm-hmm. There's always the trend du jour. There's always the rent.
There have been many.
Always the renter mob. But what they haven't had the same effect as Gaza is that they haven't had this secularized politics. I find it terrifying that we have people in the House of Commons who are elected on a Gaza ticket. And the Gaza that they're talking about is the fake, screeching, genocide-y one, not the actual just horrible war that's taking place. It's this, it's an entire section of the population who've been utterly mobilised by disinformation. And now we've got them in Parliament arguing against cousin marriage. Literally standing up in Parliament and saying it should be fine to marry your cousin and have kids. Who cares about the genetic diseases that come from it? And that's scary for me. Pushing definitions of Islamophobia, for example, that essentially make illegal any criticism of extremist Islam. Connecting Islam to terrorism is now is a crime if this bill goes through where that definition is adopted, and that means it's shutting down conversations, shutting down debates, and there's debates that need to happen, and we've seen this repeatedly with Indian versus Pakistani fights in, I think it was Bradford last year.
Sure.
And those 2 groups going at each other.
Yeah.
There's serious concern in the UK about immigration levels. And there's a danger that debate might be shut down as well. So there's a real, I think, an underlying tension in our societies that was always there, but Gaza has ripped off the mask, and I find that deeply concerning. You know, I certainly found it absolutely radicalising on 7th of October 2023, not from what was happening in Israel, what was happening in London, where we had people bursting out onto the streets celebrating the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. You know, that was the moment my Weltanschauung, my worldview changed. And I think we have real problems that need addressing.
We've been friends for a while now. We've had a number of conversations privately, and I certainly think that you have radicalized in your worldview over the last 2 years. What are some of the concerns? And I really want to sort of tie this in with the general topic of the conversation. What are some of the concerns that you have about the UK that you didn't have before October 7th?
I think the first one is susceptibility to disinformation. You know, the fact that the government are parroting these ridiculous lines to take over Israel, the fact that our media is parroting these lines to take, the fact that parts of society are out marching on the streets of London, and those marches have so many negative effects. Like, first of all, they don't have any positive effects. They're not changing a damn thing that's happening in Gaza. Like, there is no impact whatsoever on the war in the Middle East by all these people having a good shout up in London.
You really think that? You don't think it has any impact at all?
No, it's impacted UK.
I mean, surely it impacts policy.
It does. But
if governments realise there's so many people marching.
Yeah, but that still doesn't change what happens. Even if the UK government recognises Palestine, it's not going to change anything on the ground. So, you know, these people are just achieving nothing, apart from making Jews feel unsafe in central London, apart from directly assisting Hamas. Like, they may not think they're being pro-Hamas, but Hamas absolutely have generated this disinformation campaign to have precisely the effect on the streets that they've had, and to achieve those policy changes. And, you know, just this week they said that it was a reward for them for 7th of October that the UK, France, Canada, etc. are recognising Palestine. So the first and the biggest thing for me is the susceptibility to disinformation, to the point where the disinformation is now the dominant narrative when it comes to Gaza. Secondly, I think it showed that a number of immigrant communities in the UK have not embedded themselves into British society in the way that we would hope. And that is concerning. And if you look at how Denmark have dealt with this, you know, they've put a primacy on the Danish language. They've insisted that people be able to speak and start to integrate if they want to come and live in Denmark. And, you know, we've simply let people come here and essentially continue in their own little sort of micro bubble of community where they don't really engage outside of that. And, you know, I don't like that 40% of my capital city is British and 60% of the capital city is non-British. That just, you know, that just feels wrong. You know, that suggests to me that it's gone too far. And so it's things like that have been revealed, and these things I'm uncomfortable with, quite frankly. And that's really as much thinking as I've done on the topic. But the disinformation is the big one for me. And that's the focus of at least two of my next reports for Henry Jackson Society, is what on earth do we do about the fact that people can't tell the truth from the lie. They generally go with which is the louder narrative, and that's bad.
The thing that's really terrifying to me about the narratives that have been accepted about the Israel-Hamas war is when you realise that people can be so easily manipulated. And you sort of, when you start thinking about it, you sort of think, I wonder what else people have been manipulated about in the past and what they will be manipulated on in the future. The fact also that, because it's one thing to convince people, oh, there is a genocide. It's another thing to convince them sufficiently hard, go out every Saturday, every Sunday, and go march about that, and make posts about it online, and spend so much energy has been spent on this. so many human hours have gone into printing billboards and doing banners and coming up with slogans, and it's the amount of effort that has been put into this one thing, right? And the other thing that's really bizarre about it, the vast majority who are marching, be they Muslim or non-Muslim, most of them have never been to Israel or to Palestine or to Gaza. Most of them have no relatives involved, have never been there, don't speak the language, don't understand it. It's bizarre.
Can't tell you which river, which sea. Can't talk about what happened in 1948 or 1967. These things just become slogans like 1967 borders, like irrelevant, utterly irrelevant. And how many wars in history have been fought where people haven't lost terrain in cases like this? And Konstantin made a really good point on trigonometry. He said, look, if after World War II, there was a huge population transfer between certain areas of Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany.
Tell me about it.
As you well know, having
large parts of my family were displaced from the so-called Polish borderlands, so lands that are currently Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, and moved into what we call in Poland the reclaimed lands, Western Poland, what was Eastern Germany.
It sounds very Tolkien-esque. The reclaimed lands.
Reclaimed lands. Ziemi odzyskane, the reclaimed lands. Massive population transfers. And 3 generations later, people who live in what was Breslau and is now Wrocław, people who live in what was Stettin and is now Szczecin, have fully adopted, mostly with the respect for the fact that these were previously lands that belonged to someone else. There is a genuine acknowledgement that these places were, for a period of history, they were German. But they've sort of set up roots, and none of them are sort of talking about returning to Lwów, Stanisławów, Grodno, Vilnius, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, so these things happen. And look, there's a really key point that keeps getting lost here, and that is 7th of October. How would your country react if a bunch of savages poured over the border and went on a rape, murder, mutilation, massacre spree in the immediate border vicinity? Like, there's not a country on earth that wouldn't react the way Israel has, and that's what's lost in this tempo. And if Gazans are offered to leave, and they leave, well, as long as it's not a gunpoint, I can.
Is that the best solution, you reckon?
Yeah, certainly, potentially. In terms of solutions, to say I think I've got all the answers
would be
ludicrous, and I'd be a joker if I tried to claim that I could fix the Middle East. I've got ideas of how you could take strides in the right direction.
Andrew of Arabia,
my white saviour complex, exactly. So, it's ludicrous. But what I would like is incremental gains. I think that's the way to get to somewhere that's an end state that's happy for everyone. If one of those incremental gains is Palestinians relocating from Gaza to somewhere where they will live happily ever after, in good conditions, rather than just being dumped in some Yemen or something like that, obviously that's ridiculous. But if there's a way for them to have a better future elsewhere, then as long as they're not forced to go at gunpoint, then I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing. I also, by the flip side of that, have real issues with the kind of far right Israelis who want to drive the Gazans into the sea and take over the whole place and make it Israel again. So again, there's always this middle balanced, nuanced line that we need to take, and we just need to be kind of utilitarian about it. Like, what's going to do the most good for the biggest number of people, and kind of try and find a guiding principle that takes us down a pathway to, at least if not peace, then more peaceful kind of area to live in for people in Israel and Gaza.
And on that hopeful note, Andrew, thank you so much. Much appreciated as always.
Pleasure.